introduced Aaron Strong, who is an assistant professor of marine policy at the University of Maine. He has a PhD in environment and resources from Stanford and specializes in climate change policy and water quality management strategies in the coastal zone. His talk today is titled Managing Coastal Acidification, the Challenges and Opportunities of Using Water Quality Criteria. So I will now pass the screen over to Aaron and ask him to take us away, please.
All right, so let me just get this screen up. We should be on screen 2. Great. Thanks so much, Rue, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all for tuning in this morning to this webinar. I'm really excited to be relaunching the NECAN webinar series. I'm an assistant professor of marine policy at the University of Maine, and today I will be talking to you about the challenges and opportunities of using water quality criteria to manage coastal acidification in our region. So just to give you a quick little outline, first I'm going to set the scene and discuss a little bit of background on using water quality criteria and the role of water quality standards for managing ocean acidification, and particularly ocean and coastal acidification. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the options and potential approaches looking towards the future, and then close with something that I'm really hoping can prompt some discussion to talk about where we go next with this story. So my goal today is really to provide everyone with some background information and set the scene of this ongoing conversation that's taking place right now at the science policy interface around the potential use of water quality criteria that are specific to ocean and coastal acidification issues that we're experiencing. And I want to just kind of give a goal and a bit of a caveat at the beginning here. My goal is that each of you who are online, and I see 58 currently online, which is fantastic, that each of you leave this webinar with an appreciation that right now is an incredibly exciting and important time at the OA science policy interface, and that the Clean Water Act and its implementation have a role to play in that story. And that coastal acidification science and management community in the Northeast should really engage in these discussions, and that the time is now. We've gone through our scientific synthesis. We're advancing the science right now, and that there's a real opportunity to open a dialogue about what kinds of scientific information are needed to expand this management frontier right now. And the caveat that I'll give is that in no way am I advocating any particular position here. My goal is to provide this background information to make it as relevant as it can be to all stakeholders in coastal acidification, ocean and coastal acidification in the Northeast. And I say that because we'll talk about some current lawsuits that are ongoing, and so this is not intended to sort of endorse any particular position. But just with that out of the way, let's talk about some of the background that we all need to be aware of relevant to the Clean Water Act. So some of you on the call this may be second nature to you, and you may work in implementing the Clean Water Act. But for those of us who don't necessarily think about it every day, I think it's important to give some background. The goal of the Clean Water Act is really to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And it has an interesting structure. It's jointly implemented by federal and state agencies. So at the federal level, we have the EPA and the Army Corps, and then the EPA grants and delegates some of the authority to the states to actually do water quality management within those states. Not in all states, but in our Northeast states, the states have a key role to play. And there are a couple key moving parts that are part of the Clean Water Act. One is technology-based point source permitting. So any point source discharger requires a permit to discharge, and that permit has a series of requirements that are at first blush technology-based. In other words, there are particular requirements for the pollution control technologies that need to be placed on those dischargers. And the second key arm to think about when it comes to the Clean Water Act are receiving water quality standards. In other words, the technology-based requirements for point source permits are agnostic to the state of the receiving water into which discharges are taking place. But in addition to that, we have a set of water quality standards. And these standards are used in a couple ways. Again, painting really a broad picture here without getting into the details, the standards are used in two ways. One is that if they're not being met, they can be used to ratchet down the point source permit requirements. In other words, to go beyond the technology-based requirements that are agnostic to the state of the receiving waters. If the receiving waters are below a certain standard, that can be used to make the permit requirements more stringent, to implement new kinds of controls. And the second is that if point source permitting is not sufficient to improve water quality standard or to meet water quality standards in the receiving waters, there's something called a total maximum daily load, a TMDL, and you'll hear this a lot in the water quality space. And the TMDL is essentially a plan to improve the water quality, and that can involve various programs to go over non-point source loads, in addition to making permit requirements more stringent. So one question that comes up a lot, because most people think about the Clean Water Act and they think about rivers and streams and wetlands, but does it apply to marine waters? And the short answer is yes. Various elements of the Clean Water Act apply differently in state and federal waters, and of course the states are implementing the Clean Water Act in their own waters. But the Clean Water Act applies to the navigable waters of the United States, which of course includes our marine waters. And so a little bit about the breakdown between the federal role and the state role here. The EPA sets national water quality criteria. And in essence, these are a set of water quality criteria that they can give to states, and states can go above and beyond what those national water quality criteria are. And those are laid out in section under the authority of Section 304 of the Clean Water Act. And that'll come up a few times as we talk about what's been going on. The second is that EPA reviews and approves state actions, which will also come up as we talk about the sort of history of ocean and coastal acidification as it relates to the Clean Water Act. Now, what do the states do? The states set their own specific water quality standards. And let's just clarify this difference between standards and criteria. They're not fully interchangeable. Standards comprise a couple things. One is designated uses. So every single water body within a state's waters has a designated use. That could be recreation, swimming, fishing, the propagation of shellfish, a series of narrative uses that can be met or not under a water quality standard. In other words, these are beneficial services that are provided by these water bodies to human beings. Second are water quality criteria, and these are criteria that are required to meet those designated uses that are part of these standards. And the last is an anti-degradation policy. In other words, that no action should be allowed which will cause that water body to become more impaired. And so how does the state use these water quality standards? Well, they develop their water quality standards, their designated uses, and their criteria, and then they check their water bodies and see which water bodies are meeting those standards. And those that are not meeting the standards are put into a list, which is often referred to as the Section 303D list. And again, I know this is sort of dry background and also second nature to some of you, but I think it's important to go through everything as we think about the role that some of the science that's going on in the NECAN region can play in the future of ocean and coastal acidification management. So this 303D list is a list of all the impaired water bodies and what is impairing them. So let's zoom in on water quality criteria. We can imagine some of these designated uses, but what do the criteria look like? Broadly, water quality criteria are broken into two kinds of categories: narrative criteria and numeric criteria. So narrative criteria don't have numbers associated with them, but they're a state of what the water body should look like. So an example from Connecticut. Connecticut's water quality standards include narrative criteria that state surface waters and bottom sediments shall be substantially free of pollutants that unduly affect the composition of bottom fauna, unduly affect the physical and chemical nature of the bottom, or interfere with the propagation or habitats of shellfish, finfish, and wildlife. Another example is California's narrative criteria. Marine communities, including vertebrate, invertebrate, algae, and plant species, shall not be degraded. Degradation shall be determined by comparison of the waste field and reference sites for characteristic species diversity, population density, contamination, growth anomalies, stability, or supplanting of normal species by undesirable plant and animal species. Degradation occurs if there are significant differences in any of the three major biotic groups, namely demersal fish, benthic invertebrates, or attached algae. Other groups may be evaluated where benthic species are not affected or are not the only ones affected. So as you can see from these, there's no specific numeric criteria associated with them, but it's really a state of the environment that has to do with the ecological community, the biological community that exists, and whether the populations of particular species in particular groups are being disrupted, and whether that disruption impacts the propagation of shellfish, finfish, and wildlife in the case of Connecticut. These are different in every state, and generally have to do with whether anthropogenic pollutants are influencing negatively the state of the biotic community as assessed through population assessments. Numeric criteria, as the name implies, involves specific numbers, specific thresholds that are indicators of impairment. So, for example, for coliform indicator bacteria in Connecticut, marine waters have a single sample maximum of 500 per 100 mils. And dissolved oxygen criteria is such that concentration shall not be less than 5 milligrams per liter at any time. So there's a big push right now to develop numeric nutrient criteria for marine waters, which of course are relevant to one of the local drivers of ocean and coastal acidification through coastally enhanced acidification through eutrophication. But that's not the subject of this webinar. We're going to be talking in particular about criteria that might be used or developed relevant to ocean and coastal acidification. Okay, so we have narrative criteria, we have numeric criteria. They're part of a state's water quality standards. They're different in every state. How are these criteria actually used by states? So states assess individual water body segments that are monitored, usually using EPA-approved methodologies. And these are assessed for whether they are meeting the designated uses and then meeting applicable state criteria, whether they're narrative or numeric. And those numeric criteria can be specific to things like nutrients, toxics, sediments, etc. States generally develop different classes of water bodies for different uses that are ranked from excellent to fair, so there'll be different criteria that are associated with different classes of water bodies, and that relates to the anti-degradation criteria. Important for us, if a water body is not determined to meet the criteria, it can be listed as impaired, placed on the 303D list, and that list must be approved by the EPA and reviewed regularly. After this designation, as a reminder, we set a total maximum daily load for that impairment criteria in particular, including a suite of permit requirements, potential best management practices, and other measures. The TMDLs can take a while to develop after the 303D listing is done. So this is, in a nutshell, how the Clean Water Act works and the role of water quality criteria and standards. So what about acidification? What about pH? So currently, we have a national water quality criteria for marine waters for pH, which is regarded as a pollutant. This criterion was first published in 1976 and renewed in 1986. It states that marine water pH should be between 6.5 and 8.5 standard pH units, and that marine water's pH should not change more than plus or minus 0.2 pH units from normal conditions. So this, again, is the national water quality criteria issued by EPA. And this has generally been used by, have developed their own criteria for marine waters pH. So as an example of what that looks like, it's not always 0.2 units, but this is a table from Washington State. So on the left, you have different classifications: extraordinary quality, excellent quality, good quality, fair quality. And on the right, you have the pH water quality criteria that are part of the water quality standards for Washington State. For example, pH must be within the range of 7.0 to 8.5 with a human-caused variation within the above range of less than 0.2 units, or this 0.5 units, or a broader range for fair quality. As you can see, that is built more or less directly from the national water quality criteria. And in the Northeast, we again have a range of these specifics, so each state is different. And these are for impairment for pH, but generally we see either just a range, for example, in Connecticut, or a range plus the 0.2 units outside of a normally occurring range, as we see in Rhode Island, or 0.5 units as we see in Massachusetts, with an added narrative criteria that there shall be no change from natural background conditions that would impair any use assigned to this class. So this is the state of our water quality criteria for marine waters pH generally around the country, and particularly in our NECAN region. So how do states use marine pH criteria? Well, if you look at their impairment listings, you are not going to find a whole lot of water bodies impaired due to acidification. In fact, as you can see here, this is from Maine, you see a lot of fecal coliform impairments for different water body segments, for example. Now, ocean acidification is sometimes mentioned in these reports. And for example, in Hawaii's report from a couple years ago, the state describes that coastal pH is assessed for OA, but waters are not to be found that are impaired under the existing criteria. In other words, we have these criteria, but these criteria are not generally the source of any impairments that are being listed by the states currently, in part because there's a broad range, and in part because of some of the challenges of assessing baselines that we'll get to as we talk about this further. Now, there are some states and territories that have impairments for designated uses. Remember this narrative criteria, designated uses of aquatic life. You know, these are assessed through population assessments of biological indicators for these biologically narrative criteria. Sometimes, in a handful of cases, where the drivers are coastal runoff pollution and pollution from septics, pH is listed as a cause of these changes in the biological status. Now, it's important to recognize that this isn't actually through the acidification mechanisms that we're talking about, that this is simply pH due to extremely low pH environments associated with direct pollution. But they are examples of marine waters that are being impaired due to pH from local sources that are being listed. And here's an example of that from Puerto Rico, where you see in the list that in 2014 the cause of impairments, thermal modifications, and pH from a variety of sources, and the designated use that triggered the impairment is for the fish, shellfish, and wildlife protection and propagation criteria. And this is just to illustrate that it's not like we are incapable of using what we have to go after pH as a change in the biological criteria that exist. It's just not common practice now. So we're at a bit of a conundrum, right? We know that it's ocean and coastal acidification is a problem. We have the science to demonstrate that it's a problem, but of course not always a problem in all circumstances, and the science is advancing rapidly in understanding the multiple drivers of ocean and coastal acidification in addition to anthropogenic CO2, as well as the areas in which it's occurring most rapidly, as well as the areas in which it's having already occurring negative effects on species. We all know that from these synthesis reports that the state of that science is A, advancing rapidly, but B, also not fully fleshed out, where we can point to particular broad brush statements that we can assign. In other words, we have more work to do. So we know that acidification is a water quality problem for our nation's coastal waters, including the use of its natural resources, such as shellfish. We know that acidification is caused by a suite of drivers. And we know that pH is considered a pollutant under the Clean Water Act, and the loss of those uses, those beneficial uses, is generally considered to be an impairment, but we aren't using the Clean Water Act to manage acidification. So the question before us is, can the Clean Water Act and can its implementation be modified to really go after and include acidification? And what would that look like? So that was the question that just about a decade ago, about 9 years ago, prompted a long sort of legal history that I'm going to go through next as we continue to set the scene. And that legal history was prompted by the rapid advances of ocean and coastal acidification science that took place in the early 2000s. We're all familiar with the pictures that we see here of pteropods and oysters. and oyster larvae. And so the question was, in light of this rapidly advancing science, are EPA and states correctly implementing the Clean Water Act requirements when it comes to ocean acidification? In other words, should they be doing this now? We already said when we reviewed everything just a moment ago that they really aren't, and that the numeric criteria that exist for pH are generally not being used to determine any marine waters to be impaired. And so that observation and the rapid advance of the science led to an organization called the Center for Biological Diversity to sue both states and the EPA regularly over the course of 9 years, starting in 2007, going all the way up through September of this year. There were really two central arguments, legal arguments, advanced by the Center for Biological Diversity here. One is that the current existing numeric and narrative biological criteria require listing of certain waters as impaired for acidification, and that listing is not taking place. And secondly, they petitioned the EPA to update its national standards, its national water quality criteria under Section 304, to reflect the latest science. And here is a legal history, and this is something that I've put together. There are other versions of this timeline out there, but I think it's something for all of us to be aware of as we think about moving towards the future, is where have we come from over the last 9 years or so. There's a lot of text on the screen, and that's, if I were teaching a class, I wouldn't put as much text on the screen, but this is for posterity so people can review it later, and I wanted to get it all up here. 2007, the Center for Biological Diversity requested that Washington State's Department of Ecology assess water bodies as impaired due to ocean acidification impacts. At the same time, almost, they petitioned EPA to update Section 304, those national water quality criteria, to reflect the latest science, which they argued had changed since the original criteria were released in 1976. The next year, the Department of Ecology in Washington State refused the request for a couple reasons. First, they argued that the numeric data that CBD presented were general in nature. They were about global pH changes and not specific to Washington State, highlighting a need for state waters-specific biogeochemical monitoring and pH monitoring. Secondly, they argued that the numeric criteria that exist in the state, Washington State has a range, and the 0.2 pH units are sufficiently being met right now so that there is no impairment. And finally, on the narrative criteria related to impacts on shellfish, they argued that the general narrative criteria in the state requires a specific source of the threat, which was not laid out or identified. In other words, it was not clearly known that acidification was the cause of the changes in population, in particular around oyster larvae, that there were other drivers and other influences, and the relative contribution of those different drivers hadn't been assessed yet. In 2009, at the start of the Obama administration, the EPA responded to the petition and agreed to review its guidance on the potential use of OA-specific criteria. And then that same year, EPA approved Washington State's Section 303D list, which included no water bodies impaired due to OA. And the Center for Biological Diversity then sued the EPA for that approval. The EPA in 2010 agreed, and this was really something that set the stage for where we are now, agreed that Section 303D, these impairment listings, can be used for impairments due to ocean acidification, and has promised to develop guidance on how to do that, but says that the lack of data currently is a major problem for actually implementing impairment assessments. The Department of Ecology again updated its impairment list, again didn't cite pH-related impairments, but it did list Puget Sound as an area of concern due to ocean acidification under its narrative criteria. Now that's not an impairment, and no TMDL was triggered. Flash forward 2 years later, again, CBD petitions the EPA, in this case to override 15 state standards as inadequate to address OA. Basically, the CBD is trying to get EPA to act on this. In 2013, there was another suit, this time over EPA's approval of 303D lists for Oregon and Washington State. And in Oregon, it was the argument was that the narrative criteria were violated, and in Washington State, it was both the numeric and narrative criteria were violated. 2 years later, a district judge agreed with EPA's summary judgment motion, basically arguing that while CBD had standing to sue the EPA over its approval, that EPA had reviewed the data relevant to ocean and coastal acidification, and as the agency was due deference, and that basically CBD would have to demonstrate that EPA acted in an arbitrary and capricious manner in ignoring acidification. And because EPA cited inconclusive studies and a lack of specifically in situ field studies for biological impacts, EPA was well within its authority to approve a list that did not include impairment for OA. And flash forward to today. So last month, or a month and a half ago, there was another suit filed in a federal district court because EPA has not updated its water quality standards, despite indicating plans to do so from 2010 on. And part of what's driven that challenge associated with that is that EPA cites our available monitoring data. And then just a few days ago on the West Coast, there was a large meeting convened from a variety of stakeholders associated with the West Coast Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia panel. That was Oregon and California, to convene EPA, state agency officials, scientists, industry groups, and nonprofits to discuss the potential future development of criteria that are OA specific and what those criteria might look like. And that's where we are today. And in part, this is because EPA is planning and has indicated its plans to develop guidance for what OA-specific management under Section 303D should look like. But we don't really know what that is going to look like. And right now, the people around the country who are involved in these management questions are discussing what those approaches to OA-specific criteria might look like. So that's really where we are today. There have been a series of lawsuits. It's been raised sort of in profile as an issue requiring attention to develop new criteria, or at least guidance on what criteria, what states could develop as criteria. EPA can set national water quality criteria, but of course the states are free now after the 2010 ruling that 303D can be used to experiment and develop some of their own approaches to a combination of biological, narrative, and numeric criteria. So let's move to the next section of the webinar and talk about what some of those potential approaches might look like and what's being discussed right now as potential approaches, what some of the opportunities and advantages of different approaches are, and what some of the challenges are. And let's weigh those challenges and advantages in light of our current state of the science. So the first approach is to use biological narrative criteria rather than numeric criteria. So essentially use this criterion associated with the beneficial use of the propagation of shellfish and or other general narrative criteria about impacts on particular species, and use those as a designation of impairment. So this is something that CBD has been suing over in Oregon and Washington State. But of the advantage is that nothing new is required. Most coastal states have some version, and each state is different, as we talked about in the beginning, of a criterion associated with beneficial use from shellfish propagation. And usually the current state of that criterion is associated with population level effects of a particular contaminant. The challenge, in addition to the fact that many states have different versions of what can trigger that criteria, and different versions of how to assess biological indicators, is really this proof or required data that demonstrate that species impacts in a water body are linked to OA-related stressors. In other words, there's two kinds of things that need to be shown. One is that there are negative population impacts that are currently occurring that requires a baseline of biological assessments and indicators. And the second is we need to show that the change from that baseline in the population is linked to an OA-related stressor in particular and not other stressors. And the third thing that I'll add here is that by focusing in particular on the biological narrative criteria associated with shellfish, this potentially limits specific forms of OA management to its shellfish impacts. In other words, impairment is only relevant if there are impaired growth of shellfish species, which may not reflect the full ecological impacts of ocean and coastal acidification beyond the impacts to shellfish communities, depending on how the criteria are developed. And a quotation about this from a recent paper coming out of that West Coast group on this subject, I think really sums it up nicely. The biggest challenge associated with biological assessments is the lack of co-location between long-term biological and chemical monitoring, which inhibits the ability to connect the biological response of the population with an acidification stressor. In other words, the clear takeaway from this from a monitoring design standpoint is that the communities that are involved in long-term biological and ecological monitoring need to align their work with the communities involved in chemical monitoring and biogeochemical monitoring of the carbonate system. That's a clear takeaway if this is to be advanced and used as an approach to managing ocean acidification under the authority of the Clean Water Act. The second approach is to update the pH criteria, right? So we have this plus or minus 0.2 or plus or minus 0.5 unit change from naturally occurring conditions and the 6.5 to 8.5 pH range in our current criteria in most but not all states. The proposed form of what new criteria would look like that was originally in the CBD petition is for marine waters, pH should not deviate measurably from naturally occurring pH levels as a result of absorption of anthropogenic CO2 pollution. So the advantage of this is pretty clear. pH is already a recognized pollutant. Compared to some other chemical monitoring, it's more widely monitored right now. But this whole question of the natural range of variability and its deviation due to anthropogenic influences requires baselines in all of these water body segments. Estuaries have really highly variable pH, as we all know, so the challenge of determining the baseline is really one that is localized on individual water body segments, and that means individual bays, individual estuaries need to have this kind of monitoring data because of how highly variable it is. And that is a major monitoring challenge that we're not currently meeting, but certainly would be fantastic if we could meet. Related to this, but separately, is that even if we recognize all of the sources of pH variability other than CO2, we have to build a budget for these drivers. This is one of the recommendations coming out of the Maine State Commission process, is that we really need to know the relative contribution of different sources of pH variability in estuarine waters if we're going to use any form of a pH criteria for impairment designations. A third approach is to continue with numeric criteria, but rather than use pH, which of course is not perhaps reflective of all the full suite of impacts of acidification, to use aragonite saturation state omega, or perhaps another carbonate chemistry parameter such as PCO2 as the basis for numeric criteria. So here I think is pretty clear that there's a relatively robust body of evidence, although I put mostly in parentheses there because certainly in the literature there's been some debate recently about whether we can use aragonite saturation state and a threshold of 1.0 as a sort of key indicator of negative biological impacts. But the saturation state is frequently used, frequently cited, and certainly there's a robust body of evidence highlighting that it's biologically relevant. The extent to which that needs to be demonstrated in every water body segment is unclear, but certainly there's a logic to using carbonate chemistry parameters here. The challenges, of course, are that the sources of variability aren't strictly anthropogenic, and there's a real need under the Clean Water Act to isolate this source that we can go after when we have an impairment designation. And that would be a major challenge. And secondly, compared with pH and compared with biological criteria, there's much less monitoring and mapping. And currently, we don't have a good solid carbonate chemistry baseline. We have fantastic models, and we're rapidly improving our understanding, but there's a real data need associated with this. The fourth approach to put out there is to do something completely new. So rather than using our existing pH criteria or adding a new numeric criteria, rather than using our existing biological narrative criteria, we could develop an ecological narrative criteria that is specific to the circumstances in the state of science around acidification. And this has an advantage of allowing tailoring to the problem that the state of the science can be adequately addressed most directly. But the challenge is we don't really know what this looks like. It's new and challenging, and it potentially be really slow. So as each state needs to set their new standards in response to any kind of move from the EPA to set a new national criteria, it might be slow on the uptake. That being said, there's room for innovation here to think about if we could design these criteria in a perfect world, what would they look like? So really, as is evidenced from the previous, what is really key in any of these approaches, whether it is pH or carbonate chemistry omegas or any kind of biological ecological community, is that baseline data and monitoring are key. We need to improve the coordination of our monitoring and the coverage of our monitoring if we're to move forward with this. But we need to do so in particular ways. And just as a reminder to all the scientists on the call, targeted studies and peer-reviewed literature on individual water bodies go a really long way to sort of helping the cause here. They're really an important component in addition to long-term monitoring. And of course, these are some examples from our region, both the buoy that's out in the Gulf of Maine, and then the rapid advances in nearshore monitoring data, which of course in this example is from Friends of Casco Bay. But a few key takeaways here. Linked biological and biogeochemical data are required. We really need to combine our monitoring. And secondly, data in state waters is required if states are going to do this. So we need to really focus on the near shore where, yes, the variability is higher, but that coverage needs to expand. So we're certainly not there yet. I posed this question, are we there yet? We're advancing our monitoring. The bottom left is a map of all the organizations associated with the main Ocean Coastal Acidification Partnership, the MOCA partnership, including a few of the monitoring stations and our new buoys. There was a synthesis report put out last month by the MOCA partnership, of which I'm a part, that provided updates to the goals and recommendations and a few examples of some of the monitoring efforts that are currently going on, and the need, highlighting in particular the need to coordinate to really build a coast-wide monitoring network. It's not just important for our understanding of the dynamics of ocean coastal acidification, it's directly important for management. So what happens if we do develop some new criteria of one of the four approaches that I laid out? Well, the most likely is that if we have impairment designations under those criteria, we would then try to develop a maximum, total maximum daily load, a TMDL, for acidification. That could trigger a couple things in addition to point source limits on nutrient loads associated with coastal acidification as a driver, and I put a question mark there because it's not a certain thing, but certainly there's a potential that that particular local driver could be well integrated because it's already part of the permitting structure. There could be new best management practices for other non-point sources that drive acidification. But EPA has been pretty explicit so far, and I think we're beyond the point at which we expect a TMDL for anthropogenic CO2 from fossil fuel emissions associated with this. This was part of the original sort of thrust of some of the lawsuits, but in tracing this legal history, I think that's really not on the table right now. It's unlikely to be the case. Now, there's a lot of criticism in the literature that TMDLs are a bureaucratic exercise and relatively ineffective overall at actually accomplishing anything in particular, because non-point sources of traditional conventional pollutants are really challenging, and of course ocean coastal acidification presents its own set of global and local drivers as challenges. but I want to, this is sort of me talking here, and really highlight the advantages of TMDLs. A recognition of an impairment in a water body due to ocean and coastal acidification, coupled with regular monitoring that would be necessary for that impairment designation, would be a tremendous boon and really likely help any adaptation efforts associated with effective industries in our region. The mantra, of course, is measurement is the first step to management, but I think it really can't be overstated that having the kind of data we would need to make these impairment designations, having the publicity of what an impairment designation means, and having the process of a TMDL which outlines a series of best management practices would provide sufficient data and awareness and education and outreach that it would really likely improve the state of avoiding the negative impacts of ocean and coastal acidification in our region. So even if a TMDL maybe doesn't solve the mitigation side of the problem because it's largely being driven by things that aren't just localized drivers, there's still a potential advantage for it. Now, just earlier this year on the West Coast, Stephen Weisberg and a bunch of other folks published this paper in Ocean and Coastal Management, which lays out many of the things I just told all of you, highlights the differences between numeric and narrative criteria options, and it works through a couple case studies, one for pteropods and one for oysters, about what some of the monitoring and science challenges are associated with actually fulfilling the West Coast states' current requirements and what might be possible with new criteria. And so it outlines Washington State, Oregon, and California. And if you haven't read this paper yet, I highly encourage you to read it. It really sets the stage for, I think, where the discussion is now and where it can move moving forward. So I've outlined some of the background on the Clean Water Act, different kinds of criteria, 4 potential approaches moving forward that have been mooted at one point or another, and there are a variety of forms associated with them. All of those point to the need for increased and enhanced monitoring, which I think we all agree with, but in particular certain kinds of monitoring that unite biological and chemical monitoring programs that have more of a panoptic coverage that is more focused on the near shore, so that individual segments of concern are well monitored as best as can be. Of course, that may be for pH in addition to carbonate chemistry parameters. But where do we go from here? We all agree that monitoring is important, and it's nice to have it highlighted, and there's some specific guidance about it. But what's next? Well, basically, things stand at this. So this, in response to the lawsuit from CBD, this most recent one in September, this was an article in The Atlantic, which I also encourage you to read, which it has the title, Why the EPA Doesn't Regulate Ocean Acidification, and basically sums it up with the subheading, in part, it's because no one knows how best to do it yet. Well, we in NECAN are uniquely positioned to be part of that conversation about how best to do it. And what kinds of science we can bring to bear on the problem, and what the relative advantages and challenges and opportunities of different, a combination of different approaches might be. EPA has indicated its intention to move forward with this, and on the West Coast, at least, the discussions are basically being kind of open discussions about what different potential avenues forward look like. So, again, this is me, speaking on my own behalf, but I really think that we've kind of crescendoed right now in 2016, moving towards 2017, and that the time has come for a path forward on criteria development. That this is basically going to happen, and the question is, what is it going to look like? And what is it going to look like is going to be shaped through iterative discussions with states, state agencies, scientists, industry groups, EPA, and other non-governmental stakeholders in our region. And so a few things on the horizon related to that, and then I'll close and open it up for questions. And one is that in about 2 weeks, the Maine Ocean and Coastal Acidification Partnership is going to host a mini symposium in Augusta, and there, I think registration is just about full for that, but hopefully many of you will be there. And part of that is going to be an open discussion about some of these options that we're hoping to initiate at the main state level in one of our NECAN states. The second, and that nothing is finalized about this, but there have been discussions about potentially having a spring 2017 workshop to discuss OA-specific standards and criteria in the Northeast, what that might look like. And again, without any particular agenda or goal other than to bring relevant people together to discuss the relative pros and cons and feasibility of different kinds of approaches and monitoring, where we can learn from what the West Coast states are doing, learn from what EPA is thinking, and advance the state of the discussion in our region. And the third thing I'd like to throw out there is, and also this is to gauge any interest if there's anyone out there who's interested in collaborating on this, but we have a small group of folks who are currently starting discussions about essentially a Northeast version of the Weisberg et al. Paper from last year that highlights the circumstances in our northeastern coastal states as case studies for criteria development. What could we do with the science that we have now? What more science would we need to go after different approaches on impacts? And you know, it's impossible to sum that up because it is so localized and so specific to the different states and their own criteria, and then so specific to the different potential impacts on different species or different approaches to criteria development. So it's really hard to provide a detailed summary, but a case study approach allows for looking through one by one a few examples of what that could look like. So I hope that I've accomplished my goal in convincing you that this is an exciting time to think about the development of new criteria and approaches as specific to ocean and coastal acidification, that there's a tremendous opportunity for the contribution of scientists and for the expansion of monitoring that would help directly contribute to these management paths forward, but that this should all be done in an integrated and concerted manner rather than piecemeal, and that one of the roles that NECAN can play is in bringing groups together and convening all these different stakeholders to advance the state of OA and ocean and coastal acidification management in our region. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks so much for listening.
Aaron, thank you very much. An excellent talk, and we do have some questions here. So I'm just going to put them out. Remember, everybody, if you're listening and you have a question, please type it away into the questions box. We've got 4 lined up right now, and the first one is from David Dow. Here on Cape Cod, we have TMDLs for total nitrogen to improve water quality and restore habitats in our impacted coastal embayments. Decaying macroalgae on the bottom lower the pH in the sediment and water column. How could this be linked to controlling ocean acidity from climate change effects?
Thanks so much, David, for that question. It's a really great one. And yes, for total nitrogen and nutrient loading, criteria and the use of TMDLs is quite advanced. And there's kind of 2 moving parts here. And the challenge is that nutrients, nitrogen, are part of the coastal acidification story, right? And you highlight that, for example, they stimulate macroalgal growth, with the decomposition of which increases PCO2, in particular in bottom waters. And the development of numeric nutrient criteria for marine waters has been ongoing through guidance from EPA over the last 10 years. Some states have advanced more than others in their use of nutrient criteria. And the question is, should acidification-specific criteria point to, use, or take advantage of existing nutrient criteria, which are not specific to acidification as a route to particular impacts? And so one of the approaches might be to piggyback off of the development of nutrient criteria. But right now, these conversations have kind of gone in parallel, where there's conversations about the expanded use or what the future development of nutrient criteria should be and what makes them more effective or not. And there's conversations about the development of OA-specific criteria that are separate. So at our main discussion that's going to take place in 2 weeks, we actually have separate presentations on Maine's approach to nutrient management and nutrient criteria and OA-specific criteria. What it would be great to see is the effect of nutrient management, and this is a study that I think I don't think has been particularly done, but yet, but I think would really help some of these discussions forward and might be possible with available data. Is what effect have nutrient regulations, nutrient criteria-based controls, TMDLs for total nitrogen, had on acidification relative to a baseline? In other words, what do we accomplish with your example from Cape Cod? How much of a difference does it make? Finding that out really, I think, necessitates this broader question of what the acidification budget is in different embayments, and I think that's something that will advance not only the use of nutrient criteria, but advance the use, the development of OA criteria. So thanks so much for your question.
Next question is from Evan Shearer, and it is, coastal waters have large variations in pH on diurnal scales, far more than the decrease in pH found in global ocean models. If coastal waters are monitored for pH, won't the signal of OA be lost in the natural background noise?
Thanks so much, Evan, for your question. Absolutely, this has been one of the big problems with using this 1976 definition of a big range for ocean pH and this 0.2 units from natural variability. Because natural variability in these systems is really high. We know that on a tidal cycle, on a daily cycle. Here's a seasonal cycle of changes in pH over the seasons from Casco Bay. So any approach that sort of treats pH like a traditional pollutant, where we're just looking at whether it's kind of gone up or down from a set level, ignores the strong biological control and other hydrodynamic controls on pH. But if you look at trends over long periods of time that incorporate all that variability that go up or down, you can see evidence of increases in acidification. You know, sure, there was variability 100 years ago and it went up and down, but if you look at where the baseline of that variability was, you know, in 1916 and where it is now in 2016, that's where you see the shift. And so the challenge is to develop criteria that incorporate that baseline. But it's a real challenge because any given time when you go out and measure or monitor, you might be, you know, plus or minus from that line. So how do you know? Well, you know over longer periods of time, right? Over trends over years. That just isn't the way we've traditionally thought about doing criteria and impairment designations, because usually we're thinking about this spike in fecal coliform bacteria or the presence of a toxic chemical. This is different. And that's one thing that I think should lend itself to the development of a specific approach to acidification that takes into account exactly the problem that you're talking about. And I think that's part of, it's a great way to summarize the challenge of using the Clean Water Act to go after acidification. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. A couple of things here from Judith Weiss, and the first one is more of a comment saying that the standard for triggering impairment of 6.5 is more acidic than pH levels that cause effects in many organisms, and then she follows that up with a question about states can't change atmospheric CO2, but they can regulate nutrients, coming back to the nutrient thing again, but that they are already doing this for eutrophication. Main causes are non-point sources that are just voluntary for farmers, etc. So what exactly could states do to regulate OA?
Thanks so much, Judith, and I agree with everything that you just said. So let's talk about what levers we could pull and what difference it would make. First of all, you're absolutely right that 6.5 at the low end of the range is not adequate for our understanding of the effects on some species. That's one reason to think about using aragonite saturation state or carbonate chemistry parameters. It's one reason that all of these lawsuits happen, because we are seeing effects even in water bodies that are officially not impaired because they're within that range. And where we don't have the data to assess the deviation from natural variability and associate with particular anthropogenic drivers. The original goal of all of this was to think about whether this could be a way to go at CO2 emissions, but it basically is not going to be. And so what are the local drivers, the local levers we can pull? And you're quite right. We have non-point source pollution. That's a primary driver of eutrophication in many but not all systems. We already have nutrient criteria in many but not all systems. What would be the advantage of OA-specific criteria? And there are a couple things I'll say. One is that it's not just nutrients in terms of these localized dynamics and drivers. We have changing discharges of fresh water, and some of that is associated with climate change, some of it is associated with other sources of variability. Not all of it is anthropogenically controlled at the local level, but they can really affect the carbonate chemistry to the delivery of low alkalinity waters. But more than anything, the slide that and I'll just zoom to it really quickly, where I talk about what do we get if we have a TMDL for ocean acidification. This might be anathema to folks who are really trying to think about mitigation, because fundamentally, even if nutrient-driven eutrophication is 10% of the OA problem in coastal areas, and freshwater runoff is another 5%, and other localized sources that are affecting it are another 5%, and the rest is anthropogenic CO2. Even if we did the best job possible for TMDLs for those nutrients, we're not going to solve the problem. But what are we going to do? We're going to recognize the impairment and have regular monitoring for that impairment that is going to be directly helpful for mitigating the effects, in other words, adapting in those particular regions. We know that this isn't uniform, right? And we need the data in order to make informed decisions about these particular areas and to improve our best management practices, because we can do a better job on nutrients right now, and acidification can be a reason to do that. And we can do a better job of managing other sources of pollution that might be affecting through multiple stressors and cumulative impacts these organisms. And we can certainly highlight the issues associated with acidification through this that ultimately will lead to better mitigation and adaptation approaches. So I agree with you. This isn't a silver bullet. It's not even necessarily the silver buckshot idea, but it is potentially part of that. And I wish I could answer you saying, well, we could easily solve the problem here, here, and here, like this. But the point is that if we're going to do anything about this problem, we have this mechanism in place that could be used.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions here. We're probably going to run past the 11 o'clock because it's come up now, but I'm going to carry on if that's okay with you, Aaron, and we'll finish up the questions. Yeah, great. So quick comment from Meg Chadsey saying that this is a great presentation and it will be archived, and we will try and get that done as soon as we can. We need to remember how to do that. Okay, and another question here from Katie O'Brien-Clayton. How do you recommend states collect the necessary data to even assess their waters for ocean and coastal acidification, given the cost?
Yeah, the cost is a major one. So the first thing is we need to have more money for monitoring. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to get grant money to do. It's not an easy thing to get state allocated, funds, but there are routes to do that. In particular, we need to improve our ability to monitor carbonate chemistry, to have better data sets for PCO2 and alkalinity and pH that will allow us to better assess aragonite saturation state throughout our waters, so we can actually point to areas that are likely to be hotspots of these impacts. And that means buoys. That means putting PCO2 sensors on ships that are running. There's been some great work that's been done out on the West Coast, putting PCO2 sensors on ferries, for example, that are regularly running back and forth across specific bays, are really improving our data sets. we need to expand our use of citizen science monitoring, and that requires good quality assurance, quality control, good QA, QC. This is something that it's an ongoing conversation about how to really develop best management practices or best practices for monitoring. And sort of ironically, giving the flavor of the talk being we need guidance from EPA, there will soon be released EPA guidance on effective monitoring for acidification, not on the use of criteria, that's what these conversations are about, but on monitoring approaches. So getting those methods right, which are used so frequently for all of these other approaches, standardizing those methods and approaches is going to really expand the ability of us for us to collate these data sets, to merge them and combine them, because they're really distributed right now. The big challenge is moving into the near shore. We've traditionally had actually kind of better monitoring through some of the long-term ocean observing systems that are a bit farther offshore. So we need to expand our ability to use the people that are in these waters and going out right now, and leverage other sources of funds to highlight that this isn't just about continuously studying a problem, but that these are the key data that are needed in order to actually do something about the problem. That message resonates more both at the federal government and in state legislative chambers.
Next question is from Joseph Kunkel, and it is, what would a case study of the Gulf of Maine look like in broad strokes, and who should be interested in participating?
Well, I hope that many people are interested in participating. And the case studies that were done on the West Coast were data available for impacts on particular species in particular states. And I think that would be a similar approach that we could use here. So we could look at the current state of Maine's biological criteria associated with clams and oysters, and what we know about oyster aquaculture impacts from aragonite saturation state changes in particular locations. So I don't even think it would be the full Gulf of Maine. I think you'd have to do it at a couple different locations. So you could look in northern Casco Bay for clams, you could look in the Damariscotta River for oysters. Moving beyond Maine, I think we could think about, there's been some really great vulnerability assessments recently for the scallop industry in the Gulf of Maine. And Sarah Cooley's paper from last year is a really great indication of some of the vulnerability assessments that we could look at. But the thing is, those are primarily in federal waters, not in state waters. And if we're thinking about states implementing the Clean Water Act here, then we need to zoom in on the effects that are taking place within those state waters. And that's why I think a lot of the bivalve aquaculture and clam flats would be a really great approach. So I would start with clams and oysters and look at a variety of estuaries in a couple different states. Take a look at the information and scientific data and monitoring data that we have now and the criteria that are in place now. Assess those. Could it be used, and then what different approaches out of the 4 different approaches I outlined would influence whether or not an impairment designation would be made. And again, the goal here is not to say these waters are impaired now or should be declared impaired now. That's not the goal of these case studies. The goal of the case studies is to highlight what specific approaches to scientific data collection would actually enable a determination to be made. And so I think it'd be great to do that alongside state agencies if they're interested in participating. I think that the groups of people that participated in Maine's Ocean and Coastal Acidification Commission would be great, and I'm hopeful that in the future other states in our region will follow with the commission process. There's some bills working through legislatures now, but we'll see where they go. That was the model used on the West Coast, so many of the people that participated in their states' assessment panels then pursued these case studies, and I think we could follow a similar model in the Northeast.
Thank you. The next question, I think, came from Beth Turner, but I think you probably answered it about the challenges in using nutrient criteria for different purposes, yeah, including OA. But she said, thank you for a great talk. The next question is from Ron Huber, and it is, can detectable effects of Atlantic salmon smolt exposure to aluminum-rich acidic waters, in parentheses, gill update of aluminum, be used as baselineable factor for waters used by salmon and other oh God, I'm having trouble today.
Anadromous.
Anadromous, there we go, species during their smotification.
That may be a bit beyond my abilities to answer at that specific level of detail, but certainly, you know, I've been focusing on shellfish impacts. There is increasing information on impacts on fish species, and I've also been focusing on marine waters and our drivers of ocean and coastal acidification. Of course, there's a long history of pH change in freshwater in the Northeast. Associated with acidification. And I think it's right to say that we should look to some of the lessons learned associated with the management of both acid mine drainage and more primarily acid rain and acid precipitation. Now that involved the Clean Air Act, not the Clean Water Act in its primary form of reducing sulfur dioxide emissions, but there was a lot of role for the Clean Water Act to assess different bodies of water, and certainly for some of the drivers of changes in pH in freshwater systems, the Clean Water Act has been really instrumental. And so, you know, thinking about acidity impacts on fish species and the role that they have to play needs to be part of this conversation. It can't, in my opinion, just be about shellfish species. So maybe a salmon case study would be something to throw in there as well. But thanks for raising that.
And Katie O'Brien-Clayton also has a bit of a comment here about the differences in the different agencies, both at the state and federal level, that are monitoring shellfish and the waters. So the FDA versus the EPA at the federal level, and in Connecticut, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection and the Bureau of Agriculture on the state level. So there's, you know, do you have any comment on the kind of the difficulties with different agencies monitoring for different things that are all part of the ocean and coastal acidification issue?
Yeah, absolutely. There's there's a lot of challenges here in what we call institutional coordination or agency coordination. And while in each state there is a delegated authority for implementing the Clean Water Act, it's not as if all controls on the sources of nutrients or all controls on the resources being managed fall under the aegis of that agency. So if you're talking about nutrients and their role, you know, nutrients may be influenced by state agricultural commissions. The State Department of Environmental Protection might be primarily charged with implementing the Clean Water Act, and then shellfish species are probably going to fall under a Marine Resources Department. You know, that's the case in Maine, for example. And that means that different agencies have different monitoring practices and different sources, and don't necessarily, you know, share their full set of monitoring data. And incidentally, this isn't just a problem for state agencies. Our networks of academic and non-governmental scientists also have coordination challenges, but they can be overcome. There's a big movement towards integrated management, right? But one of the big problems is that the statutory authorities that undergird all of our agency actions are not integrated, right? So we have at the national level, we have the Clean Water Act, but we have the National Sanitary Shellfish Program that's you know, looking at managing shellfish resources, and then we have NOAA and National Marine Fisheries Service that are focused on federal waters, as well as the coastal programs in these states and the coastal zone management you know, authorities within these states that are looking at land use planning and coastal planning. You know, it's a major challenge for sure, and I'm thankful that you raised it. The Clean Water Act tends to involve that single state agency, but the monitoring approaches that are going to be used, you know, with those state agencies, that's where some of this coordination needs to happen. There's been a bit of a gap in some of the state waters that are offshore, because USGS has lots of gauges in rivers that provide lots of good data. You know, NOAA tends to do a really good job of monitoring offshore in the federal waters, but sometimes there's this kind of gap of information in that 3-mile stretch where some of these impacts are most poignant. And so I think really focusing on state waters and the monitoring of state waters and how we can improve that is a key component of this. Thanks.
Thanks. We'll keep going. When applying, this question's from Angela Brewer, and it says, when applying the federal criteria for plus or minus 0.2 pH deviations to determine receiving water impairment, how have frequency and duration considerations been utilized?
That's a great question, Angie. In essence, it's been a real challenge to utilize them at all. So if we look at the cases that were sort of gone back and forth between the West Coast state agencies that do have these plus or minus units, which was Washington State, Oregon doesn't have that. That additional one, it just has the range. The basic conclusion has been that we don't have the ability to determine what natural variability or deviations from natural variability are, and that even if we have careful studies that show changes in populations as a result of acidification, that the biological approaches, narrative criteria, are the only ones that can be used. Essentially, as far as I'm aware of, and I could be wrong, so if anyone's out there that knows that this is wrong, I'm not aware of impairments that have been listed under those plus or minus criteria, 0.2 unit criteria from the natural variability state for marine waters related to ocean acidification. And this is part of the rationale for reviewing and revisiting these criteria, is that we know from EPA that 303D can be used. But the criteria we have now, we don't have an ability to really figure out or assess. Obviously, from the sort of scientific standpoint, as a previous question asked, it can't be a sort of static number. We need to assess over daily cycles, tidal cycles, and seasonal cycles, and then interannual variability, because we're going to get fluctuations in pH across all of those. And that's just not conducive. So thanks for your question, Angie, and I'd love to talk more with you about this in the future, but I don't know that it has been effectively used for this particular issue.
So Ron has another question about information collected by contracted environmental consultants in response to a number of different coastal issues such as spills and leaks and non-point sources. And can that data be considered to meet a standard to be usable in coastal acidification oversight?
That's a great question, and often these things come down to this kind of fight over people throwing science at each other when these lawsuits have taken place, and certainly as the decision by the judge in 2015 highlighted, the state agency is going to be, and the EPA, in approving the state agency's actions in particular, the EPA is going to be granted a tremendous amount of deference for its judgment on what constitutes adequate scientific information here, and the peer-reviewed status of that scientific information and its particular localization in the water segments that are of concern are of utmost importance. Now, that's not to say that other sources of data can't be gathered, but the questions that arise there will be focused on the methodologies that were used, whether EPA-approved methodologies were used, and what the data are that are available. Certainly, there's a tremendous amount of use of consultant-derived data and monitoring data in the full suite of water quality management that currently exists. But the state will have its own data collection and its own approaches and perhaps its own models. It'll be coordinating with a series of scientists who are also performing these kinds of monitoring approaches. But peer review becomes really, really, really important. And if we look in Washington State at where some of the indications were that impairments were going to be, impairments weren't not necessarily going to be made, but there were areas of concern around acidification. They were due to detailed, careful studies, in this case by Dick Feely, in Puget Sound, that really highlighted the changes in organisms as a result of these changes. And the attribution component of this can't be overlooked. It's one thing to get monitoring data, but unless those monitoring data can be linked to a particular OA-related stressor that we changing the chemical or biological environment over time relative to a baseline, it's tough to use these criteria as they stand now.
Right, I think we've got two more questions. The first one is from Meg Chadsey, and it says, for citizen science-led nearshore monitoring, Would measurements of only pH, temperature, and oxygen provide useful information from a regulatory standpoint? And she mentions that the West Coast National Marine Sanctuaries are piloting an inexpensive, about $100 instrument that can provide this data from discrete samples, and she then clarified that it actually only measures just pH and temperature. So,
yeah.
Your thoughts?
Yes, there was the what was it? The X Prize. There was a prize recently awarded for that hyper cheap, easily accessible pH sensor. It was one of these competitions in gizmology and the development of new awesome sensors and gizmos. And the sensor development in this is just absolutely through the roof. I mean, look at what's happened with nutrients. We've gone from discrete samples that are sort of taken at monthly intervals to a much broader, but still not fully sufficient, much broader use of optical nitrate sensors, for example, on nitrate, where I can pull up on my phone right now what the nitrate concentration in various outfitted locations in San Francisco Bay is at any different at any time, the nitrate concentration. So it's exciting to have these new tools that are available, but those tools need to be integrated into management. They've come from both government researchers and academic researchers that have advanced the use of these kinds of tools. That's great. Going to your citizen science question, this is where QA/QC and coordination and publishing are really important, right? Citizen science is exciting as an approach, but it's not at the stage right now where we're going to make management decisions based on a handful of songcasts from citizen scientists. That's just not that's just not the case. But if we can take advantage of new sensors that are well calibrated, that have set methodologies associated with them, that we can have wide networks of people involved that are coordinated through groups that are going to publish their data, that those data can then be used and sort of recognized as trying to establish a certain state of affairs. And again, there's a tremendous amount of discretion obviously given to the state agencies, rightfully so, on how to do this approach. But that's the kind of rule where we can actually expand the coverage if we do it right and sort of panoptically in an integrated approach. So any small sort of startup citizen science initiative is not necessarily going to change the circumstance here. But this is where conversations about what future criteria could look like can really have a catalytic effect. And this is one thing I haven't said yet, which is that if we move forward on advancing criteria, part of this is advancing how we do this monitoring and management, right? So sometimes we think, well, would the criteria need to follow and the management approach needs to follow, what the tools that we have are available. But in some cases, pushing the buck on some of what these criteria could look like could actually stimulate particularly new innovations in monitoring approaches and sensor development, as we've already seen from the example you referred to on the West Coast.
And the last question is from Pam DeBona, who asks, are there actions we can take to respond to acidification once we identify it? Will we be in a similar situation to where we are with marine invasives, where we're just documenting adverse effects with little or no recourse?
So I'm going to answer your question that yes, there are. Now, I say that as someone who sometimes feels on my bad days that my job is to document carefully how a sinking ship sinks, but that's only on my bad days. So I appreciate where your question is coming from. When it comes to adaptive actions to deal with acidification, there are lots of things that can be done. And in particular, if we're thinking about oyster aquaculture, the timing of low aragonite saturation state events, if that can be known, then adaptive actions can be taken to actually get through this kind of bottleneck stage in larval development of oysters and continue to have a fruitful, working waterfront and fruitful economic product by changing source waters and changing timing of activities. So that's one thing. Understanding and knowing which clam flats are likely to be impaired first can be a helpful tool in taking adaptive actions. And then finally, let's not ignore the remediation approach to mitigation here. Now, there's a lot of great work that's being done now to investigate whether targeting in particular areas through remediative actions through macroalgal, aquaculture to actually reduce the PCO2 or improve the carbonate chemistry can actually enhance the growth of other shellfish species. I think we're far away from saying, well, we can actually, directly engineer an estuary to avoid these problems, but maybe we can avoid some of the impacts on particular species if we combine, say, kelp and mussel aquaculture, or if we do those kinds of approaches. And there are active pilot studies in Maine underway to do that right now. There's been a lot of work in California recently on seagrasses and the role of seagrass conservation in improving carbonate chemistry, in particular embayments, and how critical that is. So we start seeing these new co-benefits, these new win-wins emerge as research advances, and that's, I think, where a fair amount of science is now pointing to exploring these kinds of opportunities. So there are adaptive and remediative things that can be done in some circumstances, potentially, to help alleviate some of the negative impacts of what's going on.
Great. Aaron, with that positive message, I think it's time to say thank you to you again for the presentation, which was fantastic, and for answering the questions. And thank you all who attended. We had about 60 people on, and we've still got about 34 people on. So thank you all for attending and staying with us. The next webinar will be on December the 1st at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it will be Scott Doney from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. So with that, I'm going to hang up the phone and stop the recording and turn off the webinar. Thank you.